In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Welcome to Strange Bedfellows, episode 14, and I'm your host, Lori Spencer, along with my lovely and talented co-host, the one and only Rick Walker of Maverick News. Hi, Rick.
Hello.
Hello. Great to see you. Thank you for spending your Saturday night with us. We're going to have an interesting show tonight. We thought we would take a break from all the crazy current events going on in the world. Sometimes it just gets exhausting. And it's exhausting being in this business. As you were saying, Rick, tonight at the end of Maverick News, what hard work it really is for very low pay. And we do this because it's a public service. You know, I mean, tonight we're going to talk about journalism and why people get into this business and why Rick and I have devoted 35 years of our lives to this business. Obviously, we're not in it for the money, are we, Rick?
11 cents. I made 11 cents yesterday.
On Rumble.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I think I've got like 2 fans on Rumble who give $5 a month.
Oh, yeah.
Because if it wasn't for them, I'd make 11 cents too. That's what I was making until 2 very kind people decided to chip in $5 a month. So thank you for that. But we do this because it's a public service. That's why we do it. We feel like we have that responsibility to the public to tell you what happened today, what's going on this week. Of course, I don't get to see you as much these days on Maverick News on the air. I only get to join you once a week because it's hard for me to make those weeknight shows. But I've been looking forward to this all week, and you've probably been dreading it because I forced you to pull an old videotape or 2 out of storage, and
Yep.
You're going to show us some of your work from years past, years gone by.
I said no a long time ago.
Yes, you did. I know. I've been trying to talk you into this for a year, and I brought some too, so I'm going to be embarrassed right along with you, Rick Walker. We're going to show you guys some examples of our work from the past. Like I say, we've both been doing this since we were 17, 18 years old. I started when I was 17. When did you start, Rick?
Well, I didn't start. Well, I was
Actually,
always involved in, media of one kind or another with student papers or whatever, always. Without really thinking about being involved in journalism, but I always was.
Yeah.
But I really didn't start working until I got out of college and university in my 20s. So
I remember a story that you told me once about you as a little kid, and that you had this kind of, I don't know, was it shortwave radio broadcasting set up in your basement? How old were you when you did that?
maybe 8.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, you
I
were
had a
born to do it, Mr. Walker.
Coleco CB40 base unit.
Awesome.
Do you remember those things?
Yeah, it was a CB radio, huh?
Yeah, basically. It was like a
Love it.
fancy looking walkie-talkie, right?
That's great.
So I took it and I modified. I took it all apart and I made a radio station transmitter out of it. And I had a turntable and a cassette recorder and a microphone. And then I ran wires up through in the basement, so my parents didn't know what I was doing. And then I put an antenna up on the roof of the house, and I was transmitting to the whole neighborhood.
Your parents didn't know?
No.
Well, they do now.
So
if
and
they're
then
watching tonight.
So then I thought, well, how can I broadcast like for long periods of time? So it's like a real radio station. When I have to go to school, which sucks. So I made long recordings.
Wow.
I recorded.
8-hour reel-to-reel tapes.
No, they were just cassettes. They had like you had the 120 minute ones, right? So what I did was I'd make recordings, and then I would let those run, and I would time it so that I could make references to the time, even though I wasn't there.
Amazing.
And
You thought of
so
everything.
yeah, and it was so silly.
Great.
And then so I had one running, and it was after school one day, and I'm out riding my bike around the street while my radio station's
You're
on.
listening to your radio station while you're
Yeah.
riding your bike?
But so was my dad on his CB, right? So he pulls around, he's coming down the street, coming home from work, and he's listening to me on his CB. And he says, is that you on there? And like, how can you be on there and here? And I told him, because he obviously caught me, because it was illegal, right, to do that in Canada.
it?
Totally. You had to have back then you had to have a license for a CB radio. Oh yeah. And you had to have a transmitter license, and there was a number that came with it. Ours was XM44 28608.
You still remember.
I do.
Amazing.
Yeah, so anyway, it was totally illegal. I was broadcasting to the neighborhood, and it was radio station RWRS, which stood for Ricky Walker's radio station.
That's so good. Oh, I love that story. I love that story.
My dad was not amused. He had me come home. He made me show him the whole setup. And, I thought, if I got in a lot of trouble, but I thought if my kid did something like that, I'd be really proud of him. I mean, it's like, how did you wire all that shit together?
No kidding.
Yeah.
I'd be so proud of my kid. So did your dad make you take the studio down, or did you get a license?
Yeah.
Or
No,
Oh,
you had to
bummer.
come down. You weren't supposed to do that kind of stuff. People took CBs really seriously back in the 70s. It was really
yeah.
serious stuff. Eh?
big old CB radio craze?
Yeah. I
There's
used
the
to.
Smokey and the Bandit, man.
My
Everybody
friend
wanted
across the
CB
street had a
radio.
1970 something Pinto, piece of junk.
Yeah, they were.
And he was a lot
Dangerous,
older.
too.
He was a lot older than me, and I used to go over to his house with my friends, and we'd sit in his Pinto. I was still really young, right? And he was older. He was old enough to drive. He's 16, and I was like, I don't know, like 11 or something, or 10, and we'd sit in the car and listen to the CB.
Oh yeah,
And
we
at
did
night.
that.
Yeah.
We did that. That was entertainment.
Yes,
That's what we did for entertainment before
that
the
was-
internet.
Yeah, that was the internet
CDs.
of the day.
It
Yeah.
was. Yeah, you could talk to people. That and shortwave.
Yeah, and if you could
I
get
love
Skip,
shortwave radio.
did you use Skip on CB?
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
could bounce the signal off the, I don't know, the ionosphere or whatever, the clouds, whatever. And you
Yeah.
could talk to people really far away.
Yeah.
Even though it was like crappy signals locally.
But it was the coolest thing. We thought it was the coolest thing since sliced bread at the time.
It
know?
was.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, kids today, they don't know what they're missing.
They don't. And that's why we're doing this show tonight. That's exactly why I wanted to do it. Not just as a stroll down memory lane for our older viewers who are going to remember some of the names that we're talking about tonight, but also to try and educate younger people who don't remember Chet Huntley, David Brinkley, Jessica Savitch, Frank Reynolds, Walter Cronkite, the greats of broadcast news. Tonight, I wanted to talk about what happened to journalism, where it went so wrong, why it went so wrong, why it sucks so bad today. Rick and I are old enough to remember a time when journalism didn't suck and the TV news was actually great. And they had real journalists working at the major networks, and we only had 3. We remember a time before cable television.
Or maybe it was all a lie.
Sometimes I think about that.
And maybe we were just being fed the information because there were only three stations or three
Right.
networks, and there was no alternative.
That is possible. I mean, there was certainly government control here in the United States back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. There was a lot more government control of media than people realize.
Yeah.
Certainly, the first presidential press conferences, for example, Dwight Eisenhower was the first to do them on television, but they were not live. They had to go through the White House for censorship. And if Ike had said something in that press conference that he didn't want out there in the public, the media would edit that part out before the press conference was put on the television. Same with radio. So people didn't realize it at the time. They didn't realize that their news was censored, but to some degree it was, even then.
I can only say that when I got into to journalism, I did not experience any kind of editorial interference, really,
No,
to speak of.
me neither.
There were a couple of things that I didn't like that happened, but just isolated incidents. Overall, I was pretty much left alone. Change a word here, change a word there, just to clean a script up to make it more understandable.
Yeah. I
fit
would
into a
usually
time
get
slot.
good advice and editorial input from my boss.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I was very lucky to have mentors who were experienced newsmen who'd been at it for 40 years by the time I came in as a youngster. And they mentored me and showed me the secrets of good news writing, good delivery, what's essential, good communication. I mean, I was lucky enough to be mentored by some of the best. And I'm going to show you some examples of the people who mentored me and influenced me when I was a young journalist tonight, because I think you'll appreciate their standard of excellence. And speaking of excellence, I wanted to just start tonight with my all-time favorite, the guy who made me want to be a journalist when I was a kid, David Brinkley. It's been 20 years now since David Brinkley passed away. He died in 2003 at the age of 82. But what a life this guy lived. He had a journalism career that spanned more than 60 years, evolving alongside technology. He started out as a newspaper man at a small hometown newspaper in North Carolina, moved on to network radio for NBC Radio, and he covered Franklin Delano Roosevelt's White House and was also White House correspondent for Harry Truman's administration. And then along comes television in the late 40s, and David was one of the first to use that new medium for a nightly newscast, kind of pioneered what that was, what we now call the NBC Nightly News. He started that in the late 40s. And of course, later, the Huntley Brinkley Report was the top rated evening news program for over a decade. I don't know if many of you are old enough to remember Huntley and Brinkley, but they showed us how it's done. And then, of course, he went on to ABC and did This Week with David Brinkley for another 16 years. So he spent 38 years at NBC between radio and television. And then he went to ABC and stayed there until the end of his life. But I wanted to show you a little bit of a Brinkley flashback. This is when he left. You're probably old enough to remember this one, Rick. He left NBC in 1981. And you remember good old John Chancellor, of course, or Chancellor.
Yep.
It was never John Chancellor. It was John Chancellor. That's how he always said it. This is Chancellor's farewell, and we'll take a look back at some of David Brinkley's great work for NBC.
David Brinkley decided recently to bring to an end his career at NBC News, which spans 38 years, and go on to other work. His appearance tonight on the NBC magazine with David Brinkley will be his final one at NBC. He began in television in the old days of fuzzy black and white pictures on little screens. Since then, he's done it all. As a writer, he is simply the best. As a stylist, he's impossible to imitate, although a lot of people have tried. Many memories around here tonight.
Today's news today.
In Washington, politics is always a major
I knew you'd love that.
condition, but lately it's been more so.
And be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours.
Today we had a cameraman at the White House spend the whole day making pictures of Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower. First, she greets 8 members of the Senior Girl Scout Troop 25 of Ridgewood, New Jersey. A little later in the day, 10 minutes later, here came the winner of the National Cherry Pie Baking Contest. Well, we were off to a flying start in many ways, Chet. I was a little staggered to see this convention start on time, and so were the delegates because they weren't here.
We were here in our not very commodious but most comfortable glassed-in booth. It used to be that Eastern money, the Republican Party. Now, Chet, I believe you were telling me the other day about some Wall Street bankers.
First of all, I don't know too many Wall Street brokers and bankers.
Well, I might say you impressed me when you were telling it. I was led to believe you're widely acquainted in those circles.
We do know that wherever our reporters go on the floor, they are followed by unidentified, faceless men who attempt to listen to everything they say.
Political parties have more dignitaries per square foot than any other kind of institution in America. Kansas City has done a good job setting up for its first political convention since 1928. It has even emptied a barn, normally filled with sheep, run air conditioning into it, and made offices in it for Republicans. Apparently, they think anybody who wears a Brooks Brothers suit and does not know how to tie a tie is a liberal.
He doesn't know how to tie a tie.
No, they're always crooked.
A medical researcher has surveyed 1,000 narcotics addicts and found that only 8 of them were Republicans and 999 were Democrats.
Delicious.
And if a campaigning politician could not make promises, he could hardly open his mouth.
Great camera work.
Out of curiosity, on the mall, one spring day, we asked some visitors if they would sell
It's all
us the
shaky
film
and
out of their
shit.
cameras.
It's like it's just gonna start over here. Just the standard is different in 1968.
All these piles represent a part, just a part, of the paper flooding into the office of one member of Congress, one member, in a few months.
Vienna is so much in love with its past, it refuses to leave it. The Viennese in the past didn't believe in too much work, and they still don't.
In this town, if you don't move fast, you'll be run over by a swarm of chattering Chinese.
What the hell does that mean?
I know, right?
So racist.
Going out to lunch. Egypt, the Sahara Desert, south of Cairo.
Oh my goodness.
And David,
Well, that's why they pay him the big
thanks
buck,
for
because he
these
knows how to
years
run a
of
camera.
happy
That's right.
association, and for being such an easy colleague to work with, and for all the kindnesses.
Good night, Chet. And from Washington, thank you, and good night for all of us at NBC News.
Good luck, David. And good night for NBC News.
That classic closer. Good night, Chet. Good night, David.
Sounded very futuristically digital.
Yeah, the news music back then, which hurt your ears. But this past month, I started rereading David Brinkley's book. I don't know if you've ever read this. Great
No,
book.
I haven't.
It's his autobiography. Highly recommend it. Very amusing. I mean, nobody could write like David. He had such a command of the language. He was very, almost poetic. He could make the news like poetry, and always that great wit, that great sense of humor. But what a lot of people don't know, because he never talked about it, it wasn't done back then. Newscasters just didn't talk about their private lives. It just wasn't the way it was, to quote Walter Cronkite. But David Brinkley, finally, after he retired in 1995, wrote this book. And his life story is really, really something. And there's no way to cover it. We could spend the whole 2 hours just talking about David Brinkley, but I'll give you kind of a brief biography of his life. He was born in 1943 in rural North Carolina. And did I say 43? I'm sorry. He was born in 1921. But in 1943, that's when he started his career. And this was during the Second World War. And like most young men, he had joined the Army. But the Army kicked him out. They gave him an honorable medical discharge for a medical condition that it turns out he didn't even have. But it disqualified him from service, which was kind of a lucky break. It was a very lucky break. As it turns out, his entire unit was wiped out on the beaches of Normandy a year later, after D-Day. It was a 250-man unit. 245 were lost, and he most likely would have been killed, and we never would have had a David Brinkley. So he gets kicked out of the Army in 1943, and he's already got that bug. You know, we have it when we're young and we know what we want to do, and he wanted to be a journalist. So he talked to CBS News. He was working at a little radio station, and he asked his news director to call up CBS News in Washington and tried to talk him into offering him a job in the Washington bureau, because there's a world war on and he knows it's the biggest story, and he's just itching to go cover it, right? So apparently they did have a job for him, or so he was told, and he took the first train to DC and went to Bill White at CBS, and Mr. White refused to see him. Sent word that he'd never heard of me and had no job to offer, he writes. What happened? I never knew, David Brinkley said. I asked the receptionist to take a message back to Mr. White for me. Go to hell, he said. He walked 4 blocks over to NBC News at 14th and New York Streets, was hired in 10 minutes, and worked there for the next 38 years. So take that, CBS. And as you recall, CBS and NBC, they were always the two big networks duking it out for ratings supremacy and number one. And back in the 60s, it was this big competition between Walter Cronkite and the CBS Evening News and the NBC Huntley Brinkley Report. They were always, fierce competitors. So it literally started that way too. But his first assignment, get this, he's barely 21 or 22, got his first assignment covering the White House, right? Because most of his peers were over at war in Europe. So there was an opening. He was just a kid. He took it. And there he is doing weekly press conferences in the Oval Office with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he described what those were like. No president's done press conferences like that since Roosevelt was crippled. He was in a wheelchair. It was just easier to bring the reporters into the Oval Office so he didn't have to get up or move. And they would gather around his desk, and he would, do the news conference every week. No spokesperson. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the questions himself. It was very informal. And the thing that Brinkley remembers is everybody was smoking up a storm. Everybody smoked back then. And you could smoke in the White House. FDR's there smoking. He's got his Camel. He loved his Camel cigarettes, and the long cigarette holder. And the place was just choking with smoke, but everybody was a smoker back then. In fact, you could smoke in the White House until 1993. Hillary Clinton changed that. When the Clintons came into the White House, like his first day in office, Hillary made Bill put out an executive order saying that all federal buildings from now on are going to be smoke-free, which was funny because he was a smoker. He smoked big old cigars. But, back then, before the Huntley Brinkley Report, and this was true of all networks, David writes about this in his book. Up until the late 1960s, most of the TV and radio newscasts were sponsored by tobacco companies. NBC famously had the Camel News Caravan, sponsored by Camel. in which the anchors and the reporters, everybody smoked like chimneys live on the air, including David Brinkley. The makers of Camel bring the world's latest news events right into your living room. So sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. It's the Camel News Caravan presenting today's news, produced for Camel Cigarettes by NBC.
Today's news today.
Imagine that.
Which actually made sense back then because it was
That was
difficult.
a big deal.
It was difficult to get the information on the air the same day. You were shooting film, it had to be processed, it had to be edited, turned into something. It's not like today. It's not instant. Now it went from, if you think back, the first news wire, the first wire across the Atlantic, right? That changed the nature of news as well. Otherwise, before then, you had to, there were no telephones. You'd have to wait for
It'd be a
information.
week.
Yeah. On a ship or something, right? Write it on a piece of paper and
Telegram.
telegram, whatever, right? But across the Atlantic, until you had the wire, there was no communication.
That's right. Most big stories, you had to wait until the morning paper, the next day's paper, to find out what happened.
So the technology changes the way news is covered. It changes the way the public perceives it, the way you receive it. Your perspective changes. There's less information density. So you have, the first news wire that's basically set up with a cable that goes from Europe to North America under the ocean. Then you progress, into film cameras, newsreels in movie theaters. So people would go to the theaters to get some of their news. If you got those old Pathé newsreels, those would run before movies, right?
Right.
So that's
Only
the way
once
people,
a week. You might
Yeah.
get a new one once every week. That would be the news of the week.
So if you think about that changes, that affects people's minds, right?
right.
Now we have a device that's with us constantly, and we're being bombarded with information, visual information, audio, constantly. Very high tech, very sophisticated information programs, right? And I think back to, sorry, go ahead.
Instant. Breaking news in an instant, live as it happens.
That's
all
right.
over the world.
When I got into television, I carried around, they said, you can be a one-man band. Oh, that's great. 50-pound camera with like a tube camera they gave me with a side recorder, U-matic 3/4-inch videotape. The tapes were like this big, right?
Yes.
Just the tape.
That's right.
So I'm carrying around probably over 100 pounds just in camera gear, plus a tripod, plus a great big light and a giant battery belt, right? And the camera guys back then, including me, would blow out their shoulders and their backs all the time.
And that's the reason why they only hired men for that job. That's the number one reason that women, it was hard enough for women to get a job in the media back then anyway, but
That's true.
they, if they wouldn't send us on location because of the equipment. It was just too much for a little lady to handle.
I could tell you stories about the equipment.
I bet your back can tell stories to this day.
The shoulder right here, I ended up with frozen shoulder for an
Yeah.
extended period of time because of all of that.
That is no joke.
Yeah.
That is no joke. In fact, I want to show you some of what these cameras and what the equipment looked like back then, because I bet when you entered the business, Rick, in the 80s or early 90s, some of this equipment was still in use.
Yep.
Wouldn't surprise me. I know when I came in the 80s, they were still using cameras from the 1950s and 60s. Because that stuff was built to last, boy, and they would use it for 30 more years. Here's the 1960 Democratic National Convention coverage. NBC News,
For the most comprehensive Democratic
John F.
convention
Kennedy
coverage
was
starting
going
Monday.
to sweep that convention that year. Let's take a
This is
look.
Los Angeles. We could stop right there, but there's more. For example, the city's mayor, Norris Posey, here seen in one of his lighter moments, playing honorary sheriff. It's the city where a Democratic delegate on leaving his airplane is greeted by girls in white dresses, strolling musicians, a basket of local goodies, and agents of 4 candidates asking for his vote. It's almost enough to turn a man's head. A city where they hire searchlights to open supermarkets, wear shorts downtown, where the undertakers own their own cemeteries, and where they raise political money so fast, for the first time in history, a convention was paid for before it began. The speed limit on these freeways is 65, but at rush hour you average maybe 6. Some convention sessions may open with the delegates still out there, stalled, listening to their automobile radio. The crowds for anything are enormous, as for example, the Dodgers, who may be remembered in Brooklyn. They drew 150,000 people to 3 games. It's a city where the most serious problem is a shortage of water, but nevertheless has more swimming pools than anywhere else. Because of the smog, trash burning is illegal, but backyard barbecuing is not. The biggest industry is the aircraft factories, but at the moment, several are slowed down by strikes, and even where they are working, there is always the fear of a decision in the Pentagon that means the end of a government contract on which so many jobs depend. There are drawbacks, such as the difficulty of getting around, but it seems to be a good place for those who like to wear paper hats, blow horns, decorate themselves with badges, and parade the sidewalks behind a Latin jazz band. In Los Angeles, nobody minds. Across from the headquarters hotel is Pershing Square. Here, passing exhibitionists, spiritualists, crackpots, reformers, cultists, and other interesting people talk, sing, and make noise. Generally, everybody ignores it.
Nobody could write like David.
So the next word is this. I love it. So listen, ain't no you worry with them cameras.
You're about to see the first hippie. There he is. Yeah. That's the first hippie I ever saw in 1960. California, where else, right?
Then, of course, there is the nightlife, which is lively, much more so than most. The Democrats came west for several reasons. Los Angeles promised the money and delivered. The West is growing in population and Democratic voting power. The weather is good. It hasn't rained on these dates in about 90 years. There are plenty of nut burgers, celebrities, chiropractors, a fine convention hall, good food, more than enough candidates. Anything you want to buy, whatever it is, you can buy it all night. And it may be as useful for the Democrats to see the West as for the West to see the Democrats.
NBC continues now with its worldwide.
Fun stuff, huh? Great stuff. Nobody could write quite like David Brinkley. I bet you love looking at all that cool 50s architecture and the great cars. I'm sure Rick was paying attention to the cars. Yeah. So when you were a kid, did you guys have color TV, black and white TV?
Black and white. We didn't get a color TV until, oh boy, I don't know. I'd be like 12 or something, right? I remember we got one. I remember it. It was like a gigantic console thing that, it was like gigantic, and it, it took up. It was a piece of furniture, man. In fact,
it was.
In fact, do you know why the first TV station I worked at in Kitchener, Ontario, was owned by Electro Home, but it was part of it was actually started as a furniture company. Dealcraft, I think is what the name of the company was. And because they were making furniture, they ended up making televisions.
That's very true. And that goes back to the early days of radio, when you had radio consoles. Usually the owner of your local radio station was also the owner of your local furniture store, and the station was sponsored by the furniture store because the radio was considered a piece of furniture. Same with your record player, your Victrola, big old floor model.
Yes, I remember taking that old color television to the garbage dump We had it for years and years and years and years and
You
years.
shouldn't have thrown it away.
Oh,
Those sell
and-
for big bucks now, refurbished on eBay.
I remember we went to the place, and it was loaded into into a trailer, and my dad pushed that thing. It went into like a hopper thing that it would chew everything up, right? It wasn't like dumped into the landfill immediately. It had to go into this machine, and he pushed it over, and that old console TV went down in there and smash. It was like, holy crap. And
I bet that was cool, though.
Yeah, the tube broke and everything, and it was kind of sad.
That kind of makes me sad.
And do you know who you need? Everybody needs Pete Peterson. Pete Peterson, TV repairman. Pete Peterson used to come right to our house to fix that old color TV.
Oh.
And I remember one time he couldn't fix it at the house. Yeah, old tube TV, tubes, right? Inside, like vacuum tubes. He had to take it back to his shop. And it was a big job to get that thing. And he had an old station wagon, an old Plymouth station wagon. He had to load that big old console TV into the back of that thing. Yeah, but he was a great old guy. Pete Peterson to the rescue. Every time that the color would go wonky on the TV, you had to call up Pete Peterson. Get Pete Peterson. And my parents were like, Did you call Pete Peterson?
Well, I had my very own Pete Peterson in my house, my dad and my mom. True story, when I was a kid, they had a side business that they ran out of our garage, and they bought those old cool TV and radio console things and had a garage full of them. And they'd buy them cheap, people were unloading them, so they'd fix them up, which back then was easy. You could fix them with some new tubes usually and a good degaussing, and boom, it's as good as new. They lasted forever. So my folks had a whole garage full. They were out there tinkering and fixing the damn things all day, and then they'd resell them for a big markup. And had we hung on to some of those, darn it, I'd be a millionaire today, because those are worth a lot of money.
Curtis Mathis.
Curtis Mathis.
Do you remember those Curtis Mathis
sure
TVs?
do.
Do you know why they went out of business?
I don't know.
Because their TVs are too darn good. They lasted too long.
They were great TVs.
Yeah.
Those and the Zeniths were the best.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the Zeniths were the ones that we never had to do much work on. They just kept running like a top forever and ever. And this was in the 70s, mind you, like early to mid 70s that my folks had this business. I was just a little kid. So I literally grew up, Rick, in a room full of TV screens and radios. So is it any wonder that I wanted to go into broadcasting? I was literally surrounded by the darn things. And a lot of them were from the 1950s, 1960s, some of those earliest models. And, the stuff that people watched the Huntley Brinkley report on January 1st, 1959. And this was the news of January 6th, 1959, right after, and this is interesting, right after Fidel Castro and his merry band had invaded Cuba. Looks like I need to reload that video. Uh-oh. But this was right as the Cuban Revolution was occurring.
This is Chet Huntley's second and last night off. I'm David Brinkley, NBC News, Washington.
And this is NBC News, the Huntley Brinkley Report, assembled for television every weekday night by the world's largest and most comprehensive broadcast news organization, the News Department of the National Broadcasting Company.
There was a small revolution in the House of Representatives today. The Republicans voted Joe Martin of Massachusetts out of office as House Leader, a job he has held for 20 years. They replaced him with Representative Charles Halleck of Indiana, who has been Martin's assistant. The Republicans who expressed themselves said generally they thought Martin was all right, but not aggressive enough, and a party beaten as badly as theirs was in the last election needs to push harder. The vote was close, 74 to 70, and Halleck the winner. When the secret balloting was over and the results were known, Halleck and Martin came out, Martin looking a little stunned. Asked what he thought caused him to lose after all these years, he said,
Well, I've been recently sick with
a blood clot in my leg, and the physician told me not to do any running for a while, and I didn't run quite as good as today. Otherwise.
Mr. Halleck, did the White House have anything to do with your victory?
Not that I know of.
Did they give you any support at all?
No, not that I know of.
Are you disappointed that they did not?
No,
give you
I
support?
don't. I'm not disappointed about anything.
Do you think this is a reaction against what happened last November at the polls?
I don't think that had anything particularly to do with it. I don't know what Mr. Martin's idea about that is, but I don't think it did.
How about you, Mr. Martin?
Well, I really think that it was a reaction in this instance. The boys were a little confused concerning the election of last year, where we lost so many members, and they thought they had to start to make some changes, and they thought they'd start in the House.
This was by no means a liberal versus conservative contest. Halleck is one of the most conservative members of the House, and so is Martin. So in that respect, there is no change. But Halleck talks louder, is more partisan, and he knows how to kick and gouge for the Republican Party. NBC News continues after 1 minute. First, this message.
A policeman's lot, sometimes ugly, sometimes rewarding. Dragnet is the television show that presents both sides. See it tonight. Then George Gobel is seen on the premises of the Eddie Fisher show. He'll be seen, but whether he'll be heard or not is still doubtful. Someone who will be heard is Eddie's other guest, Kate Smith, exercising that famous and well-loved voice. The whole thing is in color and black and white, so don't miss it. Impresario George Burns is next, booking wide-eyed Carol Channing for a nightclub date. If Carol doesn't make it, many talented George plans to take over, like this.
Some of these days, you're gonna miss me, honey. Some of these days, you're gonna feel so lonely.
If you can call that taking over on the George Burns Show. Bachelor Bob has some new problems with Girl Friday Schultze on the Bob Cummings Show. The Californians is next, just part of the pleasant entertainment tonight over this NBC station.
Cuba took a few more steps toward a return to normal today. The Batista rubber stamp Congress was dissolved, and genuine free elections were promised within 2 years. Another sign of returning government as usual, political leaders like Castro and Provisional President Urrutia are giving interviews. A direct NBC News report from Herb Kaplow in Havana.
This is Herb Kaplow, NBC News, in the studios of CMQ-TV in Havana. Cuba's national hero, Fidel Castro, tired but triumphant, continued his victory march across Cuba today. He's about 200 miles away from Havana. Today, Castro stopped long enough for a few words with an NBC News team in Santa Clara.
You have a tremendous following, Mr. Castro, in the United States, especially now that you have won. How does it feel to win? Really, I feel full of duty and obligation. I only feel that I have to work very much for the people and to work without resting for the people, to do for what they want. What can the people of the United States do to better relations between Cuba and the United States? Well, it is a matter of wish in first place. That's right. And to improve our relation in all the economical orders, and I wish to have the best consideration as friend of the United States in the economic matter.
The victorious revolution symbolized by Castro has made Cuba the most recent of several Latin American nations to veer away from dictatorship. Along with Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela, Cuba now faces the sterner challenge of peace, namely embedding democracy permanently into its foundation, throwing off the shackles of its relatively recent Spanish colonialism, and ending the cycles of democracy to dictatorship and back to democracy permanently on the democracy mark. The new Cuban president, Manuel Urrutia, touched on a specific of this when asked what is Cuba's big problem now.
The economy that is not too bad, but that Batista disturbed very much.
Do you have anything special in mind to do along these lines?
Yes, to restore order, that is restored almost all of it, and to be a honest government in Cuba. All the people want to have honest governments.
What is the status of your sugar crop? This is the harvesting season, and sugar is your big source of income.
I think the next sugar crop will be very good economically.
What about gambling in Cuba?
No gambling at all.
Many of Havana's plush hotels have depended on gambling. Now the warning of the new regime has the hotel managers and gamblers worried enough not to make a move until the situation becomes clearer. The Castro Group and many non-affiliated Cubans believe gambling hurts rather than helps the economy, that it's hurt morale through the widely held belief that gambling's made American racketeers richer at the expense of Cubans, and the memory that ousted dictator Batista fattened his personal fortunes on the gambling casino. Herb Kaplow, NBC News, Havana.
Fascinating. You know what's really, really fascinating about that, Rick, is that the way the news, the American news, was portraying Castro, as well as the American government. He was our friend. He was the good guy. He was the great liberator who overthrew the dictatorship of Batista. And he was our buddy, and he was good until he wasn't. And boy, did our coverage change. What I'm going to show you next, we're going to fast forward just 3 short years when Castro went from being the good guy to the devil himself. And this is during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is October 23rd, 1962. The previous night, President Kennedy had made that televised address, telling people what was going on with the missiles down in Cuba. And everybody was on the edge of their seats, scared to death that nuclear war was about to break out. And it was up to Chet Huntley and David Brinkley to bring some calmness to the situation and give you just the facts, nothing more. No editorializing, just the facts.
We will conquer. Tonight, Premier Castro is addressing his people. Richard Valeriani of NBC News reports from WCKT Miami.
How about that fancy news desk? Look at the set, Rick.
I'm envious.
Looks like he's in his bedroom.
I like
I
the
am
globe.
right now.
I love the globe.
About an hour
cool.
to the Cuban people on a nationwide radio and television
And technology being what it was, we get some scramble.
Castro was bitterly angry.
Talk about a
TV
tape
Called the
dropout.
blockade the most dangerous adventure
Supposed to
since
hit
the end
the
of World War
TV,
II.
make it work better.
He said the United States undertook
Bang
the
it on this
blockade
time.
because all its other efforts to destroy the
We don't
Cuban
have a
Revolution
picture.
have failed. The speech is full of his usual
Technology
blast
was
on American
pretty
imperialism.
imperfect back then, but
Castro
it's kind of
says
the
Cuba
fun.
has no intention of letting the United States know what weapons it
There.
has. He
Let's
says
have a
that
map.
Cuba is a sovereign nation not because of the United States, but because Cuba won its own sovereignty. To take it away, he said, the United States will have to sweep us off the face of the earth. While Fidel Castro was sounding off in Havana, President Kennedy's strong words of last night are still being translated into positive action all along the eastern seaboard. This train, loaded with troops and trucks and half-tracks, is moving through Florida tonight. Its destination is unknown.
At the United Nations, representatives of the United States, Russia, and Cuba stated their positions. They seemed irreconcilable. If there was any room for maneuver, it was hard to locate. Here is NBC's United Nations correspondent, Pauline Frederick.
Security Council is in troubled recess tonight on the Cuban crisis. The lines between the United States and the Soviet Union firmly drawn. Each accuses the other of threatening the world with destruction of the UN and nuclear war. American Delegate Stevenson introduced a resolution demanding that Russian offensive weapons and bases be dismantled and withdrawn from Cuba, with a team of UN observers verifying compliance. The resolution also calls for a prompt meeting between the United States and Russia on war and peace issues, presumably between President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev. Soviet Delegate Zorin and Cuban Delegate Garcia Inchostegui both rejected the Stevenson proposal. Zorin introduced a resolution demanding that the Council condemn American aggression and order the United States to negotiate with Cuba. Stevenson will undoubtedly oppose this plan tomorrow. The non-aligned nations are trying to draft a compromise, not so much for the Council, but for a special emergency session of the General Assembly when Zorin casts a veto on the American resolution. Here are some of the highlights of today's Security Council meeting.
Mr. President, I am submitting today a resolution to the Security Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation. This resolution calls, as an interim measure under Article 40 of the Charter, for the immediate dismantling and withdrawal from Cuba of all missile and other offensive weapons. It further authorizes and requests the Acting Secretary General to dispatch to Cuba a United Nations Observer Corps to assure and report on compliance with this resolution. Upon UN certification of compliance, it calls for the termination of the measures of quarantine against military shipments to Cuba. And in conclusion, it urgently recommends that the United States and the Soviet Union confer promptly on measures to remove the existing threat to the security of the Western Hemisphere and the peace of the world, and to report thereon to the Security Council. The issue which confronts the Security Council is grave. Were it not, I should not have detained you so long. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been no threat to the vision of peace so profound, no challenge to the world of the Charter so fatal. The hopes of mankind are concentrated in this room. The action we take may determine the future of civilization. I know that this Council will approach the issue with a full sense of our responsibility and a solemn understanding of the import of our deliberations. There is a road to peace. The beginning of that road is marked out in the resolution I have submitted for your consideration. If we act promptly, we will have another chance to take up again the dreadful questions of nuclear arms and military bases, and the means and causes of aggression and of war, to take them up and do something about them. This is a solemn, I believe, and significant day for the life of the United Nations and the hope of the world community. Let it be remembered not as the day when the world came to the edge of nuclear war. It is the day when men resolved to let nothing thereafter stop them in their quest for peace. Thank you, sir.
Now, according to the statement that was made by the delegate of the United States,
Both sides of the story.
Bases. There are two types of rockets, the good military bases and the bad ones. The good rockets and the bad rockets. And obviously, the government of the United States reserves the right to decide and determine when a rocket is good and when a rocket is
Well,
bad
he looks
or
mad,
naughty.
doesn't he?
When a base is good and when a base is naughty.
Mr. Stevenson touched upon the question also of bases in various parts of the world. He has, however, failed to mention that the United States have these bases in 35 countries of the world, appropriating to themselves the role of the world policeman.
Sound familiar?
But what is surprising is that Mr. Stevenson has practically said nothing about the grounds, the political and legal and moral grounds based in the Charter of the United Nations for those aggressive acts that were undertaken by the government of the United States over the past 24 hours against the small Cuban state.
For a view of developments as seen from the White House, here is NBC correspondent Ray Sheriff.
So I won't roll too much more of that, but I wanted to show you how they covered the United Nations meetings that were so critical during the missile crisis. Even though ultimately the crisis was resolved through non-diplomatic channels, it was resolved through back channels with Khrushchev and Kennedy and Robert Kennedy negotiating behind the scenes. Still, that was the public face that the whole world was watching, was the United Nations, right? Because we created the United Nations after World War II to prevent another world war. There we were on the brink of it. And notice the way that NBC News covered it. You heard all three sides of the story, uncensored. You heard what the Cuban ambassador said. You heard what the USSR ambassador said and what Adlai Stevenson said. Today, how do they cover the United Nations in this current day and age? You never get to hear what our friend Dmitry Polyansky says when he's at the United Nations speaking on behalf of Russia.
That's right.
They cut him.
Yep.
They don't let him speak. They don't even give him 30 seconds.
Yep. Yep. Very unbalanced.
That's right.
Times have changed. Journalism's dead, as we knew it, pretty much.
Yeah, it is. I mean, all you have to do is take a look at the past. And that's why I brought these selected clips tonight of some very historic events in the history of the world, of the late 20th century, the television age. I wanted us to remember how it's done and how it's done right. And sometimes even we forget that what our job is, and it's just to tell people what happened. There's a wonderful quote from David Brinkley that I've always used throughout my whole career as a journalist, and I still use it every single day. It's my barometer. He reminds us all that it's not our job as journalists to love or to hate. Our job is just to tell you what happened as best as we can ascertain. You know, sometimes we can't ascertain things until years after the fact when all of the information becomes available.
I don't know if it's even possible to do that anymore.
Yeah. Right, because there's so much bullshit out there.
And because of the nature of the medium that we're working in,
right?
Because actually it's because of the censorship. Inadvertently, it prevents us from even providing balanced coverage. They sort of, even because of the censorship, they force you to sort of take a position. For instance, I've had strikes imposed against me on YouTube simply because I provided balanced coverage.
That's right.
And because I presented a side of the story that YouTube didn't agree with, but still presented their side of the story, not that it was their story, but the side that they agreed with. I presented both, so that wasn't allowed. So
They
just by
sanctioned you.
Yep, that's right. So I get penalized for that.
That's right. For doing journalism.
Yeah, I was accused of hate speech.
Hate speech.
Yeah. I was like,
or worse. Worse. They accuse you of misinformation when you're giving true and accurate information. You're literally doing your job correctly, and you get penalized for that. And then it makes you self-censor because you don't want to lose your channel. You don't want another strike. And I think that deprives the viewers out there, the news consumers, if you will, of the best coverage possible, the best journalism possible.
And so you end up sort of like, if you want to survive in this environment online, you almost have to sort of become an activist. You have to promote something. The successful channels all do that.
Yep.
You pick a side, you go with that team, you build a community around you, cheerleading for your side, and that's how you make a successful channel. If you try to be like me, you make 11 cents.
That's right.
Because you're not, I'm not sitting there either pro Trudeau or pro overthrow the government or pro this or, you know. So people are like, well, what team are you on? And people will support a cause, if you will, right?
Yes.
But they're not as inclined to support neutrality.
Exactly.
Which is really what we need. You need some unbiased reporting to help get you closer to the truth.
That's right.
If all you have is bias, you're not at the truth. You've got a slanted perspective on something, and at that point, somebody's trying to sell you something. There's a big difference.
Well, you know, when you and I were coming up and when we went to journalism school and we learned our craft, we were taught to never, ever, ever do that.
Yes.
Never pick a side. Never editorialize. That was the kiss of death in journalism. You could not show favor or hatred towards one side or the other. That was your job. You'd be out of work. Your name is mud in the industry.
You'd get your ass fired.
Yep. Oh,
and to this day, like I cringe. I find it's uncomfortable for me to work in this environment because I do offer my opinion. And I was trained not to do that, but here I sit doing it to some degree every night. But I'm still, I think, more balanced than the vast majority of the others out there who are doing podcasts or live streams.
That's right. And in a way, it's very freeing, isn't it? There's a great feeling of freedom after all the years we spent in mainstream media where we weren't allowed to ever express our opinions about things. Now, because of internet podcasting, we can. We're free to do that. And in a way, it's really cool as a journalist to be able to do that when you have a strong opinion on something and you want to express it. At least you won't get fired for saying that. But back then and throughout pretty much all of journalism history, it was forbidden. It was exceedingly, exceedingly rare. And I'm going to show you just how rare it was. This is one time that a major newscaster was allowed to show emotion and opinion on the air. And, you know, on the day that President Kennedy was killed, on November 22nd, 1963, everybody thinks of Walter Cronkite, right? That rare moment. And it's only a few seconds when, you know, Walter announces that President Kennedy died and he takes off his glasses for a moment and he kind of wipes a little tear. His voice cracks for just a moment, right? That was shocking. Walter Cronkite showed emotion, right? But it's interesting. Most people don't remember what NBC and Huntley and Brinkley did that night. Everyone thinks of Cronkite. So I wanted to show you this because here's Huntley and Brinkley on the same network working as a team. And yet these two men took very different angles, different approaches to how they talked about the murder of JFK. And I'll show you what Huntley said first, and then I'll show you what Brinkley said.
It's been said that television news came of age with its coverage of the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963.
Remember Jane
It
Pauley?
was television that helped hold the country together during that terrible time. On the evening of November 22nd, 1963, Chet Huntley reported the facts and held up sort of a mirror to America.
It's a logical assumption that hatred, far left, far right, political, religious, economic, or paranoid, moved the person or persons who today committed this combined act of murder and national sabotage. There is in this country, and there has been for too long, an ominous and sickening popularity of hatred. The body of the president lying at this moment in Washington is the thundering testimonial of what hatred comes to and the revolting excesses it perpetrates. Hatred is self-generating, contagious. It feeds upon itself and explodes into violence. It is no inexplicable phenomenon that there are pockets of hatred in our country, areas and communities where the disease is permitted or encouraged or given status by those who can and do influence others. You and I have heard in recent months someone say, those Kennedys ought to be shot. A well-known name. In its own defense, it said it was only joking, but the left has been equally bad. Tonight, it might be the hope and the resolve of all of us that we've heard the last of this kind of talk, jocular or serious, for the result is tragically the same.
Kennedy's death turned out to be just the first.
Very interesting what he said there, because we could give that same advice to people today. I hear you give that same advice to people on Maverick News practically every single day. But now you're free to say that. Back in 1963, it was unheard of. I mean, it had to be marked as commentary, first of all. You know, they had to put up a special graphic on the screen to tell the viewer, this is our opinion segment, right? This is commentary. This is not the news. This is a rare bit of commentary, and I do mean rare. So then you compare what Huntley just did to how Brinkley approached it. This is the same day, or rather same night. Remember, the JFK assassination changed how television news was done. We had never done continuous coverage before of anything. From the time that the news broke, around 1 o'clock Eastern time, then all the networks went into continuous coverage for the next 3 days. They were on the air practically 24/7. And what I'm going to show you now is a clip of David Brinkley from November 22nd, 1963. This is about 1 o'clock in the morning after the events of a long, dizzying day. The American people are struggling to make sense of what just happened. It's a nation in shock. And many of you watching were probably children. You may have a memory of that day, and you probably remember watching TV while your parents were sitting there crying and trying to make sense of it all, and you might have been watching this very broadcast. But the difference, Huntley took that moment to editorialize. Brinkley, on the other hand, just tells people what happened.
We're about to wind this up for tonight because about all that could happen on one day has. For some final reflection on one of the more horrible days in American history, you find there is a great deal that could be said about the political and other changes we can look forward to now, but I think it would be bad taste to go into that now, and I won't. It has all been shocking, but perhaps one element in the shock was the speed. By the Washington clock, at a little after 1 o'clock this afternoon, President Kennedy was about as alive as any human being ever gets. Young, strong, vigorous, looking forward to, no doubt, 5 more years, he hoped, of leadership in this country and of the Western world. His wife, young, beautiful, looking very happy, was beside him and seeming to be having a wonderful time and leaning across the back seat of the car to say to him, "You can't say Dallas hasn't been friendly to you." That was a little after 1 o'clock. 5 hours later, at 6 o'clock, Mr. Kennedy had been murdered. Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy was a widow, a brave and composed one that nobody could fail to admire. All of them were back in Washington, returning in the same airplane that took them to Texas to an incredible tragedy. And the sheer speed of it was just too fast for the senses. Roosevelt dead of a stroke, came back here from Warm Springs, Georgia, in a train, the sides of it draped in black crepe. It steamed majestically across the southern landscape toward Washington, taking a little time about it and giving everybody a time to think a bit about what had happened. But not today. There is seldom any time to think anymore, and today there was none. In about 4 hours, we had gone from President Kennedy in Dallas alive to back in Washington dead, and a new president in his place. There is no more news here tonight, and really no more to say, except that what has happened today has been just too much, too ugly, and too fast. Right?
Thank you, Dave. The Dallas Police Chief, Jesse Curry, announced just a few moments ago that charges of murdering President Kennedy have been filed against Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine with a history of connection with left-wing causes.
Ooh, left-wing causes. See, already they were telling you he was a communist. Yeah, they wanted you to think that Castro did it. They wanted you to think he was an agent of Soviet Russia. Even though there was, as it turned out many years later, we found out that that was not exactly true. Here we are 60 years later, about to come up on the 60th anniversary this November, and we still don't know the whole story about Lee Harvey Oswald because the United States government, and specifically the CIA, is withholding to this day very important files that will tell us a lot about Lee Harvey Oswald and his work for the CIA. But on November 22nd, 1963, they weren't lying to you. That's just all they really honestly knew. It wasn't some big conspiracy for David Brinkley and Chet Huntley to sit there and lie to you. That was just the only information they had available to them from the usual sources. The Dallas Police Department, the FBI, the White House. That's where they would turn for information, and they told you what happened. And David Brinkley right there was just telling the American people what happened.
That's
Very
right.
poetically and quite eloquently. So, yeah, so what do you
So
think?
where do we go from here?
Well, let's wrap up this tribute to David Brinkley with, you got to have this. Their last broadcast, the very last Huntley Brinkley report, was on July 31st, 1970. And even though, all throughout the 60s, they were competing against Walter Cronkite, right? The CBS Evening News. But in real life, they were actually quite good friends. And on the night of the final Huntley Brinkley news half hour, Walter Cronkite over there on the CBS Evening News said his own goodbye to them, his friends. I thought you'd like to see this. Can you see that?
Also as a colleague
Sorry.
and a good friend.
A little bit of a
Tonight,
lag
on that
here.
Other network, as we say, he's saying goodnight to David for the last time on their evening newscast, returning to his native Montana to build
Can you
a
hear
resort,
that?
and
Can
I
you see it?
suspect perhaps to get involved in
The audio's a little low, but yeah, I can hear it.
He leaves the daily broadcast scene, a giant departs the stage. For journalism
Yeah, that's
and
all
for
that
ourselves,
volume I have
we
on it.
hate to see him go. But that's the way it is. Friday, July 31st, 1970. Goodbye, Chad.
Bye and good luck, Walter.
So they made that special, that goodbye.
Direct from our
The
newsroom in
one
New York,
time those two
in
networks
color,
would
this has
even
been
speak
the
to each other
CBS Evening News with Walter
on the air.
Cronkite.
Very rare. They were actually quite good friends in real life. Boy, does that bring back some memories?
And so, this difficult moment is here. In leaving this post after almost 14 years, I recommend to you the NBC Nightly News, which begins tomorrow. It'll be in the most capable hands of David, John Chancellor, and Frank McGee. I'll be watching with interest and affection. I might also remind you that American journalism, all of it, is the best anywhere in the world.
Is it?
I want to thank the entire staff of NBC, for this nightly broadcast has not been an individual effort by any means. And as for you out there, I thank you first for your patience, then for your many kindnesses and the flattering things you have said and written. More difficult to take, to be sure, has been your criticism, but that too has been helpful and in most cases valid. But you have bolstered my conviction that this land contains an incredible quality and quantity of good common sense, and it's in no danger of being led down the primrose path by a journalist. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, I would say to all of you, be patient and have courage, for there will be better and happier news one day, if we work at it. And David, thanks for these years of happy association, and for being such an easy colleague to work with, and for all the kindnesses.
Chet, I too would like to thank all of those who tune us in and put up with us, particularly including those who write the nasty letters. McGee and Chancellor and I will be here every night. We'll miss you. Last night, NBC had a dinner for Chet and gave all of us the chance to say goodbye to him. And as a farewell gift, NBC gave him a horse. So, Chet, when you ride away to the west, to Montana, on your new horse, I will have to admit to at least a mild envy. And when you're out there under clear skies and clean air, maybe once in a while you will think of those of us still here, fighting the traffic, the transportation breakdowns, strikes, pollution, and wondering what is left that we can eat, drink, smoke, or breathe that will not kill us, and wondering what horror will be visited upon us next. In these years, I have often been stopped in public by polite who knew I was either Huntley or Brinkley, but weren't sure which, and so they would ask. Well, from now on, when somebody stops me in the street and says, "Aren't you Chet Huntley?" I have an answer. It is no man. He is the one out west on the horse. I really don't want to say it, but the time has come, and so, for the last time, good luck and good night, Chet.
Good luck, David, and good night for NBC News.
Kind of gets you right in the feels, doesn't it? It does me. I got one last David Brinkley story, though, that we got to talk about. And this was years and years and years later. And I bet you remember this, Rick. In 1996, election night, 1996, that would be his last time doing election coverage. He was at ABC then. And he delivered some pretty sharp parting shots at President Clinton. I don't know if you remember this. You know, Clinton had just won re-election. And it was the end of the night. You know how they used to kind of gather the whole crew around, Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts, and Peter Jennings, and they'd all sit in a semicircle and discuss the events of the night, you know, as they're closing out. And it's one of my favorite David Brinkley moments, because it was one of those rare moments where he editorialized. I guess he figured, hey, I'm about to retire. I don't give a damn. I'm David Brinkley. I'm going to speak my mind. And he did. He told the viewers that night that with President Clinton's re-election, that they could expect more goddamn nonsense for the next 4 years. He did. Now, he said Clinton was a bore, said he didn't have a creative bone in his body, and he was just awful. Now, of course, there was a flood of complaints about this, and David got in all kinds of trouble. But he claimed his mea culpa was, I didn't know we were on the air. I thought that supposedly it was, I guess it was like a hot mic moment for Brinkley. He did not know that he was on the air, apparently, speaking his mind. But it turned into this whole kerfuffle, right? And then the president got involved, Bill Clinton. And Brinkley actually apologized to the president for what he'd said. But he later said in an interview after he retired, when he could be more honest, and he said in his book that he actually meant every goddamn word. And he really wasn't sorry. Sorry, not sorry. And then he brilliantly parlayed the whole kerfuffle into an interview with the president. That's how he got Clinton to sit down and talk to him for an hour. Isn't that great? So
That's a
let's
great
talk
story.
about your heroes. I want to hear your story and who your heroes were when you were an 8-year-old kid broadcasting illegally in your basement. Who did you want to be when you grew up, Rick Walker?
I didn't know that I would do this. I just stumbled into it, you know. Like everything through my life was media related. Never really thought about doing this. I just always gravitated toward things that were media related. So I bugged my parents nonstop for about a year until finally they got me a Super 8mm movie camera. Film, right?
Mm-hmm, I remember those.
Yeah. So they bought it from my uncle used, and so I started to make films and school newspapers, you know, things like that. So just everything was media related. I just never really thought about it, and I've just always been involved. So that's how I got to where I'm at.
You're a natural, kid. That's what I call a natural.
You know, I thought too hard about it because when I was, I think every young person goes through this, and so maybe this is something that will help someone if they're young. We probably don't have anybody under about the age of 90 watching, but because we're so old. Well, at least I am. I'll speak for myself. But you know, I went searching for something to do as a career, and I thought, well, maybe I'll be a cop. No, maybe I'll be. I actually got the literature from the Toronto Police Service, and I'm like reading through it, and what does it pay, and what do you have to do, what education do you, all this stuff, right? I went to. I thought, well, maybe I'll be an actor. So I went for auditions, and I was accepted at 2 different schools to become an actor.
Really?
And then I thought, you know, that's probably a really bad idea. I'll probably end up starving to death.
Very bad idea.
Yeah, it's probably a really bad idea. So even though I was accepted, I didn't do that, but I'd also applied to go to school for journalism. And I was accepted for that. And I said, I'll do that. And that was, whoa, boy. You want to talk about starving to death?
Yeah. Well, here we are.
I made 11 cents yesterday. I made 11 cents.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I was very fortunate. Much more fortunate than most of the people who went through my program. I did study at university as well, economics. And I have, some political science education, and but I went to Fanshawe College to study broadcast journalism. Very, very tough program. We started out with about 45 people. Within the first week, half of the class was gone. Within the first week.
Why is
this
that?
was hands-on, right? So you had to be able to do it. The first assignment was what they called the man on the street interviews.
Mm-hmm.
You just had to go, ask the public a question, news related, come back and cut together like a 2-minute string of people's answers for radio. And half the class couldn't do it because they couldn't get up enough courage to go out and just talk to people.
Yeah, that's right. It's not easy. You got to be a little bit of an extrovert.
Yeah, and I
You
think
know,
at
and
the
you're a
end of it-
natural kid. You're a natural.
I think at the end of everything, there were maybe 5 of us that actually graduated and got diplomas.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was that hard. And if you missed even, say 2 days out of the school year, you were effed. You were effed. Like you could not catch up because of the way the whole program was structured. It was, it wasn't like an elite Ivy League school, but man, they wanted the standards at this place to be high. And so we in Canada, there was Carleton University, which was a very good journalism school at the time, still is. Ryerson out of Toronto, they've produced a lot of really prominent, well-known journalists over the years, especially in broadcast circles. And so we were, the people running our program wanted to be in that league, and it was really, really a tough program. It was.
That's good though. That's what makes you a good journalist.
Yeah,
it's got to be tough.
Yeah, and so a lot of very good broadcast journalists came out of that school for sure. Yeah,
sounds like a great school. Well, it's interesting, Rick, too. When you look at journalism today, I think one of the reasons that it sucks is, most of the young journalists coming into our industry are all elites. They're the children of elites. They went to the Ivy League schools. Yep. They, you can't get into broadcasting now without a degree. And, most of the people that we just watched and that we're paying tribute to tonight didn't go to fancy colleges. Some of them didn't go to college at all. But if they did, they went to little small town, tiny colleges and universities where they got a damn good, solid training. And it turned, the journalists used to be working class. They were reporting for the people whom they were a part of. They were a part of the working class, the people bringing the people's news to the people. But now it's the elites bringing the elites' news to the great unwashed masses.
Yes.
Very different now.
Very different. That is very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad I went to the University of Oklahoma. I'm proud of it. You know, it's a great school, but it's not Harvard. It's not even UT.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't go to Ryerson. I'm glad I didn't go to Carleton. I'm glad I didn't go to one of those Ivy League schools for that. I went to Western to study economics, but I got a great education, and I learned from people who were hands-on. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better education. I really couldn't have.
You just reminded me of something. Speaking of born to do it and working on the school newspaper, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, I was working on my middle school newspaper. Even then, I had this hankering to write, and I was interested in news. And you know what my very first story was that I ever covered as a journalist at the age of 12? I think I was 12 years old. Was this. They had me write the story for the school newspaper. I got my first taste of breaking news.
The impact of instant news came dilemmas. What happens when there is no time for editorial judgment? When apparently sound information, the reported death of Press Secretary Jim Brady during a 1981 assassination attempt on President Reagan, turns out to be wrong.
It's true, but we did have reports from the hospital earlier and from the White House that he had passed away. We know that he was in very critical condition. Let's get it nailed down, somebody. Let's find out. I don't apologize for my display of anger. It was anger, and it was anger directed more at myself than at anybody else, certainly, because I really regretted that I had not insisted on further corroboration.
He was not someone you could push around when he felt that he was wronged or that the situation was not appropriate or and somehow out of step. He was the first to express it as well. And that's a valuable asset, I think, in journalism. And Frank encompassed all of those things. He was, at the core, a thoroughly professional reporter.
Frank also had a real emotional connection with the news. He felt it. Sometimes he let that feeling show. That's not always a bad idea.
Frank has always been a get-up fighter. Get knocked down, get up. And I guess I really expected him to get up. And this time, when he didn't get up, to say that I was shocked would be an understatement.
Frank was a genuine journalist. He didn't want to get in the way of the news. He wanted to report it to people, and it never occurred to him to think what he might look like or how he was lit or whether his mic made him sound good or bad. It's one of the reasons he was such a pure journalist, and one of the reasons he was such an inspiration to all of us here at ABC News.
But perhaps the most impressive tribute was paid to Frank Reynolds during his lifetime by his critics. He always took the news so seriously, they said. He acted as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders, they said. Well, maybe Frank Reynolds knew what some others in this medium have forgotten or never knew at all, that matters of life and death, war and peace, wealth and poverty are indeed serious, and so is the power and the responsibility carried by this medium. Television is the way we learn about the world now, and Frank Reynolds helped us learn about that world fairly, accurately, and responsibly. This is Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
That was the day that Frank Reynolds died. I loved Frank Reynolds. He also passed away 40 years ago this summer. It's amazing. I grew up watching him, and I will never forget his coverage. I bet you won't either, of the day that there was the assassination attempt on President Reagan. That was my first story as a journalist. Taught me a lot. I learned a lot from Frank Reynolds, and what he taught me that day was, get the story straight, damn it. You know what he used to say? It was like his mantra: accurate, responsible, meaningful. Those three words say so much about what we as journalists ought to aspire to. We want to be accurate, we want to be responsible, and we don't want to bring you trash that doesn't have any real meaning in the big picture. It has to be meaningful. Do you remember? I bet you remember that day, the day Reagan was shot. How old were you?
Wait, I don't know what year that was. That was
81.
81. So
2 months after he was sworn in. Happened right away.
how old would I be? I'd be
If you don't want to tell, that's okay.
15, 14. Yeah.
It happened right after school.
16. Yeah.
Just come home from school and saw it on TV.
Probably about 15, maybe 16. I don't know. Something like that.
Did you watch it live as it unfolded? We're in continuous coverage that day, too. Because everyone thought, Reagan might die given his age. And we didn't know how badly he was wounded. And the first reports, when Frank Reynolds did the first bulletin, originally we were told that President Reagan was not hit. We saw that Jim Brady was hit. We saw the cop and the Secret Service guys on the ground. But, they whisked Reagan away and got him in the car. And we were told at first he wasn't hit. They didn't know he was hit until he started bleeding profusely in the back seat of the car, and then they rushed him to the hospital. But we were getting conflicting reports from the White House, and that's why Frank Reynolds lost his temper. There's that rare moment of Reynolds blowing his top because he was so frustrated that nobody could seem to get the damn story right.
Yeah, I would have been 16 years old. Yep.
Yeah. Well, you probably had bigger things on your mind at 16.
Yeah.
Like
things.
Getting your driver's license and women.
That's pretty accurate. Very insightful.
Yeah, I did too.
I'm not as complex as I thought.
So somehow I kind of stumbled into journalism too, even though I was kind of a natural at it, like you. But I just, I wanted to be a musician. That was my life's dream. And my folks were always trying to tell me, they didn't discourage me, but they encouraged me to have a backup plan, right?
Of course,
Go have another career so you can have a real job. And so journalism was supposed to be my backup plan. That was my backup career.
Oops.
Oops. And I was barely out of high school, Rick, when I got offered a scholarship for journalism to go to OU. And my freshman year, I'm like 17 years old. And I got hired at the local newspaper here, the Daily Oklahoman, to be a news writer on the city beat, covering fires and murders and courts and stuff like that. And then ended up getting a job in radio, which is what I really wanted to do. I love to write, but I loved broadcast journalism. And people told me, hey, you have a nice voice. You should be on the radio. So I went into radio broadcasting, and I was hired by a legendary station here that's unfortunately defunct called KEBC. Keep Everybody Country is what it stood for. That's KEBC radio.
You worked in a barn.
It was literally a barn. I'm not joking. With a big transmitter in the backyard.
Yeah.
And you can see our news vehicle there parked out
What is
front.
that, a 1972 Plymouth Satellite or something?
You know what? That just might be. I think that might be a Plymouth Satellite.
I'm not sure.
I don't remember because they never let me drive the damn thing. I'd only gotten my driver's license the year before. I don't think they trusted me yet with the news car, so I never got the keys to the car. But the guy who did drive the car was our news director, Bo Nance, who was a legend. He was on WKY Radio News. He was our news director. He'd been at WKY for like 35 years. He was one of the grand old newsmen, and he was my mentor and taught me everything I know. So I'm going to embarrass myself now. Oh, God. And I'm going to play you a tape from my first year in broadcast journalism. This is 1986, when Ronald Reagan was president. God, I'm old. I'm so old. This was during the first Cold War. Interesting top story, though. Check this out.
The verdict is guilty on all counts of espionage. Good morning. At 6 a.m., we have clear skies, 74 degrees on KEBC, Oklahoma City. Clayton Lone Tree has become the first U.S. Marine ever convicted on spy charges, those charges being that he traded U.S. secrets with the KGB for sexual relations with a Soviet woman. He now faces a sentence of life in prison, but defense attorney William Kunstler plans an appeal. He says Lone Tree didn't give the Soviets anything they didn't already know, and he says furthermore that his client is being made a scapegoat in a bungled investigation of embassy security. However, sentencing is set for Monday. Another U.S.-led convoy is on the move back through the Persian Gulf.
The warships that brought the three Kuwaiti tankers yesterday, the third convoy of Kuwaiti tankers, appears to have waited outside in the international waters to bring back these four tankers.
Correspondent Nabila Magali. Word of this comes not even 18 hours after a U.S. defense official reported a trio of the tankers docking in Kuwait. Apparently, the U.S. is wasting no time in taking care of business in the Persian Gulf. The rebel groups at the heart of two of the worst uprisings in Central America have agreed to hold peace talks with their governments. The Nicaraguan Contras and the Salvadorian Liberation Front have accepted a proposal by El Salvador's President Jose Duarte that envisions a Central American ceasefire by November 7th. This was all part of the peace plan accepted by 5 Central American nations in recent weeks. And some of Gary Hart's former aides are scoffing at the idea that there may be another try for the White House. One former advisor calls such talk outlandish, and pollster Lou Harris says Hart would have a real tough time if he got back in the race. Hart quit the first time around amid charges he had been seeing actress model Donna Rice. How hot was it? Well, it was so hot in July that government experts figure it cost Americans an extra $195 million to air condition their homes. And First Lady Nancy Reagan's birthday bash happens today on the Reagan's Ranch in California. The White House says she'll be 64. And although her birthday is actually on July 6th, it's tradition in the Reagan family to celebrate it on their yearly August vacation. In Oklahoma news, Kay County residents have come to the rescue. They've donated housing, furniture, food, and clothing to a Ponca City family who lost their home, all their possessions, and 2 small daughters in a Thursday morning fire. And a battle is in the makings for Oklahoma and Arkansas over the Illinois River. Yesterday, Attorney General Steve Clark of Arkansas had some fighting words for Sooners who oppose a waste treatment plant in Fayetteville. He says if the opposition continues, then Arkansas will be forced to take some cities to court for dumping their wastes in the river. In sports, Detroit holds a mere percentage point lead over Toronto in the American League East after last night's baseball action. The Tigers lost twice to Cleveland, while the Blue Jays fell to California. In the West, Oakland won and Minnesota lost, so now the Twins' lead over the Athletics is 3 games. St. Louis moved up 3.5 games ahead of New York in the National League East. The Cardinals won, while the Mets and Expos lost. San Francisco won and took advantage of a Cincinnati loss to move into a 1-game lead over the Reds in the West. And KABC weather for today, sunny and hot with the high near 100 degrees. Tonight, partly cloudy, a slight chance of a few thunderstorms. And tomorrow, partly cloudy, a 30% chance of those thunderstorms, a high of only 93. Currently, it's clear and 74 degrees in the city. And Oklahoma's new leader, KABC.
Boy, is that embarrassing. I sound like Minnie Mouse.
KEBC in Oklahoma.
We did have some fun jingles. I still remember them, too. I could sing them, but I'm not going to. Oh, how embarrassing. I had this little high-pitched voice that I was like... But
no, you had a great voice.
I guess that's why they hired me.
You had everything going for you.
Yeah, I was 17, man. I had the world
Holy smokes,
in the palm of my hand.
You certainly
17
did.
years old.
Yeah.
That was an interesting case. I don't know if you remember that story, the Clayton Lone Tree story. It was one of those Cold War spy capers. He was a U.S. Marine, and I know that Scott Ritter sure as hell remembers that story, because every Marine over there in the Soviet Union guarding embassies, that's what Scott Ritter was doing at the time. Everybody knew about the Clayton Lone Tree case because he had fallen for a beautiful Russian woman. Next thing you know, some secrets slipped out. Oops, pillow talk. And next thing you know, he's accused of, 17 counts of espionage? He was looking at the rest of his life in prison. He was a Native American, Clayton Lone Tree, and he was convicted on all counts. He served, I think, 15 or 16 years of that. And then it turned out the whole thing was, his defense lawyer was correct. It was a total overreaction. He hadn't told the Soviets anything they didn't already know, and they were going to lock him up for the rest of his life. So he finally got out after 16 years and vanished. I got curious. I went looking for him the other day because he was, big headlines back then. So I was like, whatever happened to Clayton Lone Tree? He vanished. He's still alive, I think, but he has not given interviews. He's never written a book. He just didn't ever want to face the public again. So he didn't go out looking for media attention. But so when you started doing journalism, who was president? Was it Reagan? Was it Bush? Bush 1? Bush 41?
Bush, yeah, the first Bush.
He was the first president I ever interviewed. I was working at KABC. It was the election of 1988. He was running for president. He came through Oklahoma City, did a press conference, and I got to do a brief interview with him. Unfortunately, that tape is lost, but that's okay because I never liked him anyway. But I do have a newscast with President Reagan. If you want to hear, I can't believe I'm actually telling you this. I'm that old. President Reagan was the president when I started doing journalism, which is just crazy. But here he is.
Back to the barn. Oh, that's a 73 satellite, by the way. I looked it up.
73?
73. If anybody cares, I do, but...
Removed even this artificial obstacle from consideration.
There we go.
We are therefore hopeful that the Soviet Union will demonstrate that there is substance behind the rhetoric they have repeated so often of late, that they genuinely want a stabilizing INF agreement.
The president said some further obstacles need to be overcome still, but he indicated that the prospects for a historic superpower treaty are increasingly bright in the near future. Meanwhile, the Reagan administration has reversed its position and has decided to give imminent danger bonuses to about 10,000 servicemen in the Persian Gulf region. That means about an extra $110 a month on the soldiers' paychecks. In local news, Haskell County voters have elected the son-in-law of the late county commissioner Leo Reisner to take his place. 26-year-old Kelly Stout will replace his father-in-law, who was shot to death in his truck about a year ago. A Brinks messenger carrying 2 large money bags stumbled onto an armed robbery in progress this morning inside a Safeway grocery store at Northwest 18th and Classen. Police say 2 middle-aged gunmen from Texas walked into the store and herded the employees and customers into the back. But then the Brinks guy walked in completely unaware of what was going on, and the robbers immediately seized his money bags and ran. They didn't get far, though.
They started checking the I-35 corridor, especially restaurants and motels, and were able to come upon the vehicle at Northeast 27th and I-35 in Moore.
That's Captain Mike Heath of the Oklahoma City Police Department. Not a good day on Wall Street today. The Dow plummeted 21 points as 200 million shares traded off. And some intense thunderstorm activity is developing around the state. This just in, the National Weather Service has issued a severe thunderstorm warning effective until 5:30 p.m. for persons in eastern Garvin and southeastern McLean counties. These storms have been located about 5 miles east of Pauls Valley, moving to the northeast at 30 miles per hour. It shouldn't take too long for them to reach the metro area. Also be advised that there's a severe thunderstorm watch in effect until 10 o'clock for most of southern and central Oklahoma. The forecast for tonight calling for a 60% chance of thunderstorms with locally heavy rainfall likely, our low 68. Tomorrow, cloudy and cool, a 60% chance of thunderstorms again, our high only 80 degrees. Currently, it's mostly cloudy and 89. And Oklahoma's new leader, KEBC.
Man, oh man. Okay, your turn. I showed you mine. You gotta show me yours, Rick Walker.
Okay, hang on.
I had the poodle perm, like all the girls in the 80s did. You remember the poodle perm, right? All the girls
Yeah.
with yeah, I had that going on. Jeez, that was embarrassing. I know that you guys are going to like take those pictures and spread them all over the internet to embarrass me, aren't you?
Hang on, I'm just getting this queued up.
Oh, no. I can't believe I just played that.
There we go. All right, here we go.
Show us your stuff, Rick Walker.
Don't say I didn't warn you.
Okie dokie, here we go.
Oh, hang on.
Oh, you even got the old TV set.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is your audition for CTV, huh? Oh, my.
The leaders of the world's richest countries are admitting openly there is a worldwide unemployment problem.
If there's one thing that comes out of these meetings is just how deeply entrenched some of the problems are.
The flame going 1,000 feet up in the air, it was unreal. Investigators say the fire started in a warehouse that was being used by a tire disposal company.
Rick, what time did the picket lines go up tonight?
About 2 hours ago, Lisa. There are still some workers inside the plant. It is still open, but production is pretty much at a standstill, and in less than half an hour, this plant will also be officially on strike.
All right, Rick Walker. Gotta have some
Snacks
cars.
of the 1960s and the concept cars at this year's Detroit International Auto Show are, in many ways, a blast from the past.
Look at
Concept vehicles are what draw people to the auto shows.
Over the past decade, aerodynamics have been the driving force behind automotive design, and those are the concepts that you're seeing on the road today. But in recent years, designers have started adding more lines to their concept vehicles. In short, the automakers are allowing designers to express themselves again. Native protesters have blocked this highway leading into Camp Ipperwash by setting a car and a pile of old tires on fire. Once a respected RCMP officer, Marko Yankovic, is now on trial for war crimes. He is accused of participating in the kidnapping and execution of over a dozen communist sympathizers in German-occupied Yugoslavia during World War II. I'm Rick Walker in London, where the owner of this hemp store is selling victory bonds to finance a court battle against Canada's marijuana laws.
Our final story tonight is about Amanda, a little girl who took on a big city to save her treehouse. What was her secret weapon? A multi-million-dollar insurance policy. Rick Walker explains.
In her grandfather's backyard in the town known as the Forest City, 7-year-old Amanda Nekigiri has her own special place where she plays with her friends.
We color, we play games. Once me and my friends slept over, we ate breakfast up there.
But part of Amanda's Victorian-style treehouse hangs above a city sidewalk. A little over a year ago, City Hall told Amanda her house was a hazard and ordered it torn down. Amanda's father has been fighting to save the treehouse ever since.
They had surveyors out here, they had the city lawyers on it, they had someone draft up a site plan, they've had council meetings on it. This is a treehouse for kids.
Now Amanda's father has signed a $5 million insurance policy. It will cost nearly as much to insure the treehouse as it does to insure the family's real home. But the city is backing off.
The whole house, 1,600 square feet, is $311, I believe, a year, and a treehouse of 12 square feet is $240.
Mark Nekigiri says the $240 annual insurance premium on the treehouse is so high it defies logic. But he says his daughter is worth it.
I'm glad it's over, so me and my friends can play in the summer, so now I'm really happy.
Rick Walker, CTV News, London.
Oh, is that it? Bravo. I want more. That's so good. The mustache, though. That was so Ron Burgundy. No, you were sharp, Rick Walker. That's the first time I've ever seen some of your old work. Thanks for sharing that.
Okay, so I'm thoroughly embarrassed.
I bet you are. Your Rick's just kind of shrinking down under the desk.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little about mentors and the people who influenced us and who we learned from. Mm-hmm. There's a guy, I think I told you that when I was in Austin, Texas, I moved on from KEBC, I moved down to Texas, and I ended up at a radio station called KLBJ, which was literally owned by the family of President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Interesting story. The station was owned and purchased by Lady Bird Johnson, First Lady of the United States, while she was First Lady. And, you know, she had gone to UT, University of Texas, majored in journalism. She was a journalist in her heart. You know, that's what Lady Bird Johnson had always wanted to be. That's what she wanted to do. And she got to make her dream come true. Now, mind you, this was in the 1960s when it was very difficult for women to work in broadcasting and very difficult for women to get into any kind of managerial position in a broadcasting conglomerate. So, hey, when you're the vice president's wife, you can just buy it. And so she did. She bought the damn station. It was a radio and TV combo. Back then it was called KTBC, and it was KTBC radio and KTBC television. But from the earliest days of that station, which, by the way, was actively run by the Johnson family, they didn't just own it as an investment. After President Johnson left office, throughout the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s, when I was working there, it was owned, operated, and managed and run every single day by Lady Bird Johnson herself and her daughter, Lucy Baines Johnson, who was also a journalist. And we did great, great work. And I wanted to show you a story, and I wanted to show you the man who mentored me and taught me so much of what I think I know about journalism was a guy named Neil Spells. And Neil Spells is still around. I won't say how old he is now, but he's getting up there. Neil broke a national story that's an important story in August of 1966. Some of you will probably remember it because it took the whole world by storm and shocked everyone. The first school shooting, the first mass shooting at a school, took place at the University of Texas, my alma mater. I went to UT for a while, and that's also Neil Spells' alma mater. But on that day, a crazed gunman went up the UT tower, and I believe he killed 15 people. But Neil Spells can tell you a lot better than I can. Let me find this video of Neil Spells reporting for KLBJ, which was at that time still called KTBC, and NBC picked it up at the National News Desk. You'll see Chet Huntley here introducing it. But this story, remember, Austin was a small town back then, a very small town. It was just a college town, really. And this story not only took Austin by storm and shocked everyone, but it shocked the world. Even today, it's pretty gruesome.
On vacation. I'm Chet Huntley. An hour and a half day, the normally placid university and capital city of Austin, Texas, was held in the grip of a terror which began in killing and ended in killing. A maddened former Marine, a 24-year-old student in the architectural school named Charles Pickett, first killed his wife and mother in their home. Then he fled to the top of the university tower, a 27-story building, and from there shot to death at least 13 other people and wounded at least 31. The carnage did not end until police ended Whitman's life with several bullets. Here is a report from Neil Spells of KTBC TV Austin.
A Marine veteran who was an expert marksman shot and killed 10 unsuspecting noontime killers on the University of Texas campus today. Then he was cut down an hour and a half later by an Austin police. When the shooting ended, 30 others were seriously injured. And then the bodies of the alleged sniper's mother and wife were found in his apartment, both dead. A tally at this hour
Killed his mother and his wife, too.
Wounded, and that figure includes the death of the man police say did the shooting. The sniper, identified as 24-year-old Charles J. Whitman, started shooting from the observation deck of the 27-story tall University Tower. He fell moving targets blocks away. The terror-filled 90 minutes started at 5 minutes before 12 Austin time. It was 1:22 when policeman Ramiro Martinez shot Whitman. Victims were cut down on the west and south sides of the campus as the sniper zeroed in on his targets with unerring accuracy. Those who were felled with bullets from the high-caliber rifle were pulled to safety as soon as possible by officials and passers-by. Others crouched in terror. Heavily armed Austin police, sheriff's deputies, highway patrolmen, and Texas Rangers converged on the campus and began returning the sniper's fire. But he was well entrenched, and he had a fantastic vantage point of the entire area. Reporter Charles Ward was on the scene as the gun battle raged. He described what was happening and then interviewed a Vietnam veteran who risked his life to pull the victims to safety.
Ambulances screaming all over the city, and more sounds, more shots being fired at the tower and on the tower. On the mall, with empty carton of shells. One of those who is out of breath now after running out onto the mall rescuing those who have been shot is Brian Ellison of Austin, who has been in Vietnam, has been back for 2 years. Brian, how many have you gone out to rescue?
Today, too.
What did you have to do?
Run hard and keep low.
Did you have any trouble getting them up, or did any shots come close to you while you were out there?
No shots came close to me. It's just the last one. He was dead. He was dead weight. He was a little hard to pick up, too limp. Not like someone was knocked out.
How many have you seen that are dead today?
Just one. I hope not anymore.
But many of the victims could not be moved until after the sniper was gunned down. And then the university students moved in to see what had happened. One ambulance driver was shot and critically injured trying to haul the wounded to safety. A policeman was killed as he moved in armed to try to get a sight on the sniper. A University of Texas professor was killed as he walked to class. The campus at one time looked like a battlefield. Dead people were lying on the sidewalks under 100-degree temperature, with police and others occasionally darting from cover to cover. The sniper was well armed and apparently planned a long siege. After he was cut down, police hauled out of the barricaded observation deck 2 30-06 rifles with telescopic sights, a .357 Magnum pistol, and a shotgun. He had 2 large jugs of water and a footlocker containing food and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. What caused the man to take the lives of so many and wound so many others on a hot summer day may be found in a letter discovered by the bodies of the alleged sniper's mother and wife late this afternoon. The typed letter related Whitman's headaches and his plans to kill his mother and wife, and a grim notation on the message read, "Mother and wife now dead, 3 a.m." His wife was a biology teacher at an Austin high school. The letter was typed last night. This is Neil Speltz reporting from Austin.
Again, Austin police now place the toll at 16 dead, including 14 shot from the campus tower. NBC News is planning a program on the murder and his possible motivations tomorrow night.
Your microphone is muted.
Oh, sorry about that. There. Now that right there was a real newsman, Neil Spells, who is still around, still kicking it down there in Austin, Texas. But Neil Spells won every kind of journalism award you can imagine for his reporting on the UT Tower shootings of 1966. And by the way, that tower that you just saw still stands, but it was closed to the public for 30 years. They were so afraid that a gunman might go up there and do it again that they wouldn't let anybody up there. That was an observation deck that he was shooting from. And they just closed the damn deck for 30 years. When I was at school there, you couldn't go up in the observation tower. It was just closed to the public. But anyway, back to Neil Spells. He heard my audition tape when he stayed at KLBJ for the rest of his career. He's still at KLBJ to this very day. He heard my audition tape, and he's the one who hired me. So here I am 30 years later after the UT Tower shootings on KLBJ radio in Austin, Texas. I was always a radio gal. I didn't do television. But here we are covering some breaking news.
It's not fair.
What?
Well, I had to show video, but you get to hide behind a microphone.
That's right. I'm hiding. But I did include some embarrassing old pictures of when I worked there. You
Fair
can see
enough.
me here at behind the mic at KLBJ. This is breaking news. You remember when the Olympic Park was bombed in Atlanta in 1996? Richard Jewell was the guy arrested for it. Turns out he was innocent, didn't do it. The FBI ruined his life for years. But anyway, that thing happened at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And I just happened to be there. Usually I got off work at midnight. But I just happened to be kind of working late in the newsroom. And I heard the AP teletype machine going off in the background that there was some breaking news. And so we went live on the air with it. And we did continuous coverage. Because we were a big station, we had a big crew, we had reporters in Atlanta on the ground. And so here's a taste of how we covered a tragedy 30 years later at KLBJ.
We interrupt this program for a special news report on 590 KLBJ Radio.
590 KLBJ Radio News Time 3:03. Good morning, I'm Allison Fox. We are bringing you...
Oh, I guess I should tell you I had a different on-air name. You know, we all had different names back then. You actually worked under your name. You were
Yes,
Rick
I
Walker.
did.
They had me under all kinds of different names. So when I was at KLBJ, I was Allison Fox.
Breaking news of a massive explosion in Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta. At least one person is dead, 68 others injured during a concert. The FBI has confirmed that it was some kind of explosive device. We have unconfirmed reports that it was a pipe bomb, and now they are saying that 2 more devices have been found in that area. We now take you back to live continuous coverage of the Olympic tragedy from ABC News here on your news and information source, 590 KLBJ Radio.
We interrupt this program for a special news report on 590 KLBJ Radio.
Good morning. I'm Todd Jeffries along with Allison Fox. You're listening to live continuous coverage of a bomb blast in Atlanta, Georgia, the site of the Olympics. Joining us live now is KLBJ's Kirk Bowles, who is in Atlanta. Kirk, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there, Todd.
What can you tell us? It's basically looking at all the video and listening to the sound. It looks like a zoo in that whole area. What can you talk to us about the security?
Well, apparently they're tightening security, Todd, and they're not letting anybody in the Media Press Center, which is just about a block away from the Centennial Olympic Park where the explosion went off just about 3 hours or so ago.
Kirk, how far away are you staying in your hotel from the Centennial Park?
Oh, we are north of downtown Atlanta off I-75, and by my estimation, I think we're probably about 5 miles north of there.
Boy, aren't you glad you lost your original motel room, huh?
Something you can be grateful for, I guess.
Now, the confusing side to the whole thing where they were going to or getting ready to have the press conference, that's the site where they're keeping all the reporters and keeping everyone out. So there's some confusion as to if this press conference is going to happen from the Olympic Committee.
Yes, police radio reported finding 2 other devices within the park. Those reports have not been confirmed outside of local police officials. The mayor is hesitant, to say the least, to confirm anything at this point, but they are evacuating everybody from that area. They have shut down the commuter rail system there in downtown Atlanta and all over the city of Atlanta. So right now there are a lot of stranded commuters and tourists right now walking the downtown streets with no way to get home.
And to catch everyone up to date, we have reports of at least 1 to 4 people dead and as many as maybe 200 people injured.
Yes.
And in fact, they were treating some people at the site of the Centennial Park for some minor injuries. And we do have a report that one person their arm was blown off. It's just a tragic sight, the whole area. They blocked, looking at some video here, the entire area is blocked off. And we have reports that they're using tear gas to clear the area as well.
Yeah.
And Kurt, you've been there for a week now, and security has been a major issue.
Well, it really has, Todd. They have somewhere between 25 and 30,000 law enforcement officers, including police, National Guard, FBI, and I imagine we're going to see those numbers rise, in the coming 9-10 days left of these Olympic Games.
And Kirk, the saddest part about this is the Centennial Park area was about the only area in the whole Olympic Games that is not subject to as stringent a security measures as you find elsewhere in the
That's
Games.
exactly right, Allison. It's bordered by it's fenced in, but there are several places, that you can get in, and there's no security checks whatsoever at the entrances and exits there. There are people manning, officers and law enforcement authorities manning those entrances and exits, but they were never checking any of our bags until you're actually going through a venue.
To say the least, Kurt. From what we understand, tonight's explosion occurred at Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, and they were holding a concert at that time.
Yeah, it was by Jack Mack and the Heart Attack.
Now, earlier this week, Kirk, there was a bomb threat at one of the main buildings there. They forced the evacuation for a brief time. That turned out to be a hoax, correct?
Yes, and like I said, they've been isolated, and we almost have, I wouldn't say it's on a daily basis, Todd, but it has happened. There have been several instances of that, but we almost just kind of take it with a grain of salt, assuming they're going to be that, and maybe some false reports of that. But as you two were saying before, Centennial Olympic Park would be a great venue to place a bomb because it's open to the public, it's free, and at any different time of night. We were leaving the women's gymnastics last night well after midnight, and there were just thousands of people still in the park as there were tonight.
Right.
And anybody can go through there, so it would be a great place for a terrorist to put a bomb.
kind of a tragic statement when you think that really is one of the only safe places, and a place where I think organizers thought they could trust people to just go out and have a good time.
Well, it really is. They have live music there. There are a lot of shops there where you can trade pins and buy paraphernalia there and souvenirs, and I will not be at all surprised if they shut that down for the duration of the games. We've been told that right now there's been no scheduled or rather rescheduled any of the events that they are supposed to go on as scheduled.
Yes, that's true. NBC is saying that the games will go on. No big schedule changes tomorrow. It will be interesting to see how all of these people will commute to the games without use of the commuter rail system there in Atlanta.
That's exactly right, Alison. Last night when I was coming back from the swimming venue at the Georgia Tech Aquatic Center, there was just a lot of gridlock downtown. And it was about as bad as I've ever seen, because when we go to these venues, these outlying areas, we are transported by bus to the Media Transportation Mall, and from there we take our buses to our different hotels and dormitories where people are staying. And we thought it might have been due to the fact that Vice President Al Gore and his wife were in Atlanta yesterday and seeing some of the different Olympic events like the field hockey. And anytime President Clinton or Vice President Gore have been here, you can expect lengthy delays and security checks, as well as the transportation of the buses, shuttles of the media, and the fans.
Carter, you've been working for the paper for quite a long time now. Take us back in time to the Munich Olympics, where we had another terrorist incident.
Well, in 1972, when the Palestinian terrorists took over, the commandos took over a dormitory where a lot of the Israeli athletes were taking, and I believe 11 of them were eventually killed in a shootout at the airport there. We pray that something like that is not going to happen here.
Absolutely. In fact, someone was just mentioning to me, it is pure speculation at this point, but what if someone had been planning this initial bomb as kind of a smokescreen for perhaps a larger bomb, a larger event, and they had mentioned that there was some concern with the big crowds coming in for the track and field competition today.
Well, you're exactly right, Alison. That's a very scary proposition when you're talking about the largest venue here, as well as it is next door to the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. They're right adjacent to one another, and that's where the baseball is being held. And the United States is playing Cuba Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock at that ballpark, and it's also at the height of some of the track competition.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to live continuous coverage of the bomb blast in Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta. A bomb blast in the middle of a concert going on in the park. We understand that at least 1 to 4 people are confirmed dead, and up to as many as to 200 people injured. We're talking with the Austin American Statesman's Kurt Bowles, and also with the 590 KLBJ radio news team. We'll join ABC coming up in about 4 minutes, live at the top of the hour.
Yeah, it brings back memories when they bombed the Olympics. And there was like a manhunt for years to catch the guy who actually did it. But they prosecuted the wrong guy. Remember Richard Jewell?
I really don't. I don't recall.
Really?
No.
Yeah. The FBI told us he'd done it. He was like Lee Harvey Oswald. Turns out he didn't. They had the wrong guy, and they had to search for years. I forget the name of the man who actually did the bombing. But yeah, that was.
But did you have like Frankenstein's monster in the back room with all the big dials and things, on your equipment? Like,
yes. Do you see that old board that I had in one of those pictures, with the knobs that were as big as your hand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That board was from the 1960s.
Yeah, I learned on an audio board like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Me too. Worked on them for years. They built those things to last. It's not like the technology of today where we have to get a new laptop every year because the old one is obsolete. Nope. Back then, man, you were working with a microphone from 1965 and a board from 1961, and
Yeah.
by golly, it still worked. They didn't get rid of those things until the 90s, when you saw some primitive computers start to creep into newsrooms. You could see in some of those pictures the old desktop computers that we had, big old monitors, this big.
Yeah.
And they were quite temperamental, as I recall.
I remember people losing their jobs because those computers came in and they just could not figure it out.
That
They
too?
could not there was a sports guy who shall remain nameless.
Hmm.
I even tried to help him myself, and he just could not figure out how to save a file.
Yeah, just couldn't get the hang of it.
No, he was just too old.
That's right. And also, a lot of jobs in our industry were lost, well, for a couple of reasons. And this is where the death of journalism really begins to happen. In 1996, that same year that we were just listening to, that's when President Clinton put through the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which essentially consolidated media into the hands of 5 or 6 mega corporations. And those corporations still own almost every radio and television station in America today. But back then, because they were consolidating, what do big companies want to do? They want to increase their bottom line. And how do you do that? You cut jobs. And thanks to this new computer technology, they could do that because you could pre-record in advance and put the darn thing on autopilot. So they did what we called voice tracking. And it was where a disc jockey or a news person like me would record my newscast. Instead of doing it live, I'd be recording news for the overnight shift and into the next day, and it would run on autopilot. So you just hope that no breaking news happens overnight while everybody's home asleep. There was nobody manning the newsroom after that in the hours, say, between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. when the morning show started. So what happened that night, that kind of breaking news coverage that we brought you, we also covered TWA, Flight 800, when it blew up in that same year, I think. That happened late at night. And we had to come on the air, right, with this breaking news. But after that, they cut a lot of jobs because it only took one guy to voice track 24 hours worth of programming. And they just put it on autopilot and the computer would run it. And that's how most radio stations to this day are run. Your local radio station in your town is probably running programming that was recorded in Chicago or Detroit or some other city, and it was recorded in advance, so it's not really live.
Did you know even movie theaters run that way now?
Oh, no. There's no live projectionist up in the booth?
They have like central servers. The files are sent out to the theaters. Yeah, it's all digital.
No, I didn't know that. I can't say as I'm surprised. So there's a lot of out-of-work projectionists, is what you're saying.
Yeah, they still have a projector, obviously, but it's all sort of remote control, and they have files, right? Just video files, and they run them.
Wow. That is
not like the old days. Have you ever seen like an actual movie projector? Like yeah, because they had like these rods that would go down in, and they're basically a welding rod, right? And then they just burn that rod, which is almost as bright as the sun, right? And you'd have these big reels, but it's not like that anymore.
Wow. So much has changed, Rick.
Sure
so much has changed. And in our profession, when we talk about the death of journalism, if somebody asked me what killed it, I would say 3 things. One was abolishing the fairness doctrine in 1986. Since you're in Canada, I don't know if you had something similar to the fairness doctrine, or if you still practice it. I don't think you do, because I watched some CTV and some CBC. Obviously, they're not interested in both sides of the story, but from 1928 until 1986, it was literally the law in the United States on the broadcast airwaves, radio, television. We had a thing called the Fairness Doctrine, and it just meant that if you did one side of a story, you were required to be fair and also get the other side of the story. That's all it was. But in 1986, for reasons I'll never understand, President Reagan decided to get rid of it. And so the Fairness Doctrine was abolished. You might have heard recently that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., presidential candidate, is talking about if he becomes president, he intends to bring back the Fairness Doctrine. And I think he's absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. If you want to save journalism, that's one of the big ways that you can do it, because so much of what we see is partisan. And that's the second thing that's killed journalism, is pushing a certain partisan narrative, whether it's Fox News on the right or CNN and MSNBC and ABC and all the big networks have gone pretty woke. You get that on the left, but you never really get the fair, accurate reporting. You don't get both sides of the story.
What's a journalist today?
Boy.
Who would the Fairness Doctrine apply to?
All of us, including the internet. You know,
Okay,
I mean,
so you have, like, again, though, right? What is a journalist? Who's forced to provide both sides?
right, right.
Is
Because you don't,
Russ- is-
you know,
is
is
Jimmy
Russell
Dore?
Brand a journalist? Is Joe Rogan?
Jimmy Dore?
Jimmy Dore? Right.
Are they
Because they have a
journalists?
definite opinion, you know, a certain point of view. I don't know if they could do that. They're not trained as journalists. They didn't go to school like we did
They
to
build
do
their
this.
they build their audiences on a demographic that relates to their point of view.
That's right.
So you
And a
start
lot of
be-
viewers don't
start
want to hear
being
the
like-
other side.
That's right. Start acting like me, and you'll make 11 cents. And
Same here.
You know, the Fairness Doctrine can apply here, but
Yes.
but
And would the
maybe-
viewers put up with it? Because, you know, people today, we've had this partisan divided news media now since at least 1996, when we got the Telecommunications Act and everything became corporate and everything became partisan. We've had a whole generation now that thinks that is journalism. They don't know any better unless they're watching this show tonight, or they like watching old TV. They really don't know what real journalism is and what they see on Fox, or they might think Russell Brand is a journalist. They think that that's news.
More than that, I don't believe in censorship, but I do see websites, Facebook pages, it's so on, for there's sites that are just, it's all full of clickbait, fake stories, like right up straight fake stories. I talked about this tonight on my show about a guy who says he's a journalist, acts like a journalist, talking about the injection, lipid nanoparticles embedded with the Marburg virus that will be released into your bloodstream on October 4th, when the 5G radio waves hit you, which is part of the emergency broadcast test system. And then it will trigger an epidemic of the Marburg virus that will turn people into, and I forgot to mention this part on my show earlier tonight, it will turn people into zombies.
Zombies. Literally zombies. Yeah.
So, and there's a website that has this story that it's supposed to be a news site. It's been picked up by some other streamers. Are they journalists? So does the Fairness Doctrine apply to them? I'll throw it to you. What do you think?
How would you enforce that?
Well,
You couldn't,
therein lies the
possibly.
question, right?
Right. And does that lead to more censorship? Would they use
Well,
it as
that's how they're trying to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
That's partly why we're getting all the censorship we're getting, is because of sites like that. The government is saying we can't have this, so we need to crack down on it. A lot of it is political, but I'll put it to you that those kinds of stories are really political in nature anyway, because there is an underlying, ongoing campaign to simply undermine trust and confidence in our institutions, in our government, in our healthcare system, in everything. And because this is like some conspiracy against the people, that story really is designed to undermine trust in government, to destabilize it. That's there's the clickbait and making money aspect of that, but the relentless, ongoing distribution of that kind of information through these sites, there's no doubt it's aimed at creating instability.
And it's also creating a great deal of revenue for these people who run these channels.
That's right.
And they're taking advantage of, I think, the people's mistrust of government, the people's mistrust of mainstream media. Obviously, we see the ratings. We see people increasingly tuning out of NBC, CBS, ABC, CNN, etc. Even like Fox News, and they're going to the internet to get their news, and they see something on TikTok or Twitter, and it looks official, right? And so they think it's real, and the next thing you know, it goes viral, and that's how a story travels around the world in seconds. And a hoax can travel around the world in seconds, because there's nobody sitting at the national news desk who is experienced, who knows how to research these claims to see if they're true before you put them on the air.
So you are literally having people fall prey to snake oil salesmen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's demented. A lot of this stuff is just crazy. And no journalist would ever take it seriously. We could spot that fake in 30 seconds or less, which is why you're always doing that here on Maverick News every day. You're debunking bullshit news stories, news that's being sold as news on the internet. And you know darn good and well it's not. It's just not true.
Yeah.
Accurate,
that's
responsible,
why I make
meaningful.
And that's why I made 11 cents yesterday.
That's right. Because real journalism doesn't pay. But you know what?
Those guys
It never did.
Yeah,
it never did, Rick. Remember that.
If I came on and said that people were going to be turned into zombies on October 4th,
You'd make a ton of money.
I'd make a ton of money.
You would. And people would be throwing donations at you going, more, give us more. Give us more fear porn. We want to be afraid. Scare us. Scare us harder, Daddy. Here's some more money. And that's exactly what they do. That's what the viewers unfortunately reward with their contributions. They reward the channels that play to their fears and their paranoias. And
strangest thing.
It is, isn't it? And it's tragic. Tragic what's happened to our profession, which is why this conversation we're having tonight is so important. And I know we're running over time. Did you have any other tapes from your archives you'd like to share? I guess not. Okay.
No, I think you've seen
I'll take
enough.
no for an answer. I think I better stop too. But before we go, I wanted to end on a note of remembrance for probably my greatest hero of all time, the lady who inspired me to become a journalist. Of course, David Brinkley was my favorite male journalist, broadcast journalist, but the woman who told me that, yes, girls can do this job too, and that you should try it out and see if you can do it, was a lady named Jessica Savitch. Anyone remember Jessica Savitch? Next month will mark 40 years since Jessica Savitch died. She died in October of 1983. At that time, I was an aspiring kid, dreaming about a career in journalism. I wanted to be that lady right there. And you'll see why here in a minute. If you don't remember Jessica, I think you'll recognize that she was truly something special. And unfortunately, her life was cut short at the tender age of 36. At the height of her career, she was at the national anchor desk at NBC News. She'd been there for several years and worked her way up to the top, which was extremely rare. Even Barbara Walters wasn't on the anchor desk. There weren't very many females who got that coveted gig. It was always a man, right? Because for most of broadcast history, we were told when we applied for jobs in this industry that nobody wants to listen to a woman read the news. They said that women's voices were not authoritative. They said that nobody wanted to watch women do the news on TV because other women would be jealous, right? They'd see this pretty woman sitting there all dolled up, and all the women sitting at home with curlers in their hair would hate her. And Jessica was beautiful. She was like knockout model pretty. But she showed us all that you could be beautiful and smart and be taken seriously and do the news so very well. So I thought this would be a nice thing to play for you in honor of Jessica Savitch, who still influences young journalists to this day. With the 40th anniversary of her death coming up, there's actually kind of a renewed interest in Jessica Savitch. And, there have been movies made about her life, biopics and whatnot. I think there's a new one coming out, a new book about her. But she changed my life, and I know she influenced a whole generation of female broadcasters and journalists to follow in her footsteps. And we're still trying to this day to be as good at it as she was. She died in a freak car accident, which was very similar to Chappaquiddick. Remember the Ted Kennedy incident, Chappaquiddick, where his car went off the bridge and a young lady died in the car, Mary Jo Kopechne. Oddly enough, the way Jessica died, I don't know if you remember this, but it was really strange. She was out to dinner on a date with a man, and in fact, he was the vice president of the New York Post. And they're out on a date, right? And they go to this restaurant, and afterwards, just as soon as they'd left the restaurant, they weren't drunk. They only found like half a glass of wine in their system, no drugs or alcohol involved. But it was a rainy night, pouring down rain. Instead of turning onto the main road, he took a wrong turn, ended up on a tow path and drove into the water, and the car flipped upside down and they were trapped inside the vehicle, him, Jessica, and unfortunately her beloved dog, Chewy. And everybody knew Chewy. Chewy was always on the show with her. And they all died together. They were trying to get out of the car and the doors wouldn't open. And it must have been a terrible way to go for several minutes. So that's how we lost Jessica Savitch 40 years ago. But I wanted to show you something from the very beginning of her career. She was at a local station in Philadelphia. And in 1977, she got the big gig. She got to go to NBC National in New York. And this was her last goodbye at her local station here in Philly. And it's just kind of a nice montage of Jessica Savitch and why we loved her.
As many of you already know, tonight is Jessica Savitch's last program with Eyewitness News. Starting next week, she will be with NBC in Washington and will also be seen anchoring from New York.
Yes, Roy, it has come to that portion of this particular broadcast they have labeled Savitch Farewell. This will be my final broadcast as an employee of KYW Television. Beginning in 2 weeks, I will take an assignment with NBC Network News. And since KYW is one of the stations across the United States that carries NBC News programs, my reports will continue to air right here on Channel 3. And what that means is that I find myself in the unique position of leaving and staying at the same time. The standard script on an occasion such as this one calls for you to thank everyone on the personal as well as the professional level who made it all possible. And I'm also told the script should be brief. That means you are charged with the awesome task of saying next to nothing and meaning almost everything. I've long been a believer in using the public airwaves for messages meant only for the public. And so all of those colleagues and friends and associates and the people I love who did indeed make this last 5 years in Philadelphia personally possible for me. All of those people I have personally thanked, and that leaves only one thank you left. The thank you that I have saved to fill the time the station has graciously allotted me, and that thank you is for you. There were times when we did well, and I would so much wish that you were watching. And there were times it wasn't so good, and I'd wish you'd blink. And I have to admit there were times I almost didn't believe you were out there at all. And then every once in a while, into this horizontal, vertical, 3x4, two-dimensional box of a world through which I'm required to communicate information, there would come a letter, or a phone call, a word on the street, or even just a feeling. And I would know that there was indeed a third dimension, that the message was received and the cycle complete, and that you were really out there after all. That's what I thought about as I labored to fill out the slot labeled Savitch Farewell. Not that this job meant almost everything to me for the last 5 years, but that somewhere in that time, it may have meant something to you. You made it all worthwhile, and I do thank you.
Well, we all wish Jess the best when she joins NBC, and we here at Eyewitness News have put together some of the highlights of Jessica's career at Channel 3.
I was afraid. Here's what's happening. I don't mean the series to frighten you. On the contrary, I'll be taking a close-up look at Philadelphia Rock. Police training is rugged and demanding, but then so is the job. Join me in training, on patrol, and in two major cities where it seems to be working. We don't promise you any answers in this series, just some information from experts and from people like yourselves you might want to consider before making a decision of life and death. Tomorrow, a look at how couples prepare to share the natural high of childbirth. Philadelphia traditions, Philadelphia neighborhoods, and Philadelphia people have been a part of Hollywood ever since all of those cattle feedlots became studio lots feeding entertainment to a nation.
It was a typical teenager. I'm sure she had her excitable moments in high school, not always the calm person she appears on TV.
Really, I really wanted to look pretty, too.
One other item of note, Bill Custer, pay attention. For almost the first time in 5 years, I found out Jessica Savitch has ears.
This could definitely mess up a hairdo.
No kidding. What should I do about my hair? Either I could get a new hairdo or I could change direction. That's worse.
Jess, sorry I can't be with you on your last broadcast on Channel 3 News. But even on videotape, it's difficult to say goodbye to someone with whom you've worked so closely for 5 years. We are pleased, though, that you are joining NBC, so we can at least claim you as a member of our team. No one in Philadelphia TV has achieved more in such a short period of time. Needless to say, we're very proud of you. I wish you the best in the years to come. Good luck.
I don't care if that isn't right. We're not doing it again.
Thank you. What can I say after I've said thank you? That was
Good luck. You're going to
Roy.
Just great.
Thank you so much. People at Channel 3 are really terrific, and I'm really happy that we're going to turn the show over to Roy, and that Vince did that, and you're all great, and I better be quiet.
Okay, let's go to Jack Jones, who's standing by for the 6 o'clock edition. Jack.
Yes, good luck to you.
She had such a delightful laugh, didn't she? One of the things that I loved about Jessica Savitch, and one of the, I think, ways that she revolutionized television news was, we were never allowed to express any kind of emotion, right? The anchor was always supposed to be stone-faced. You couldn't smile, couldn't laugh. Those things were inappropriate, right? But Jessica, when she was delivering a story that was particularly sad, she would kind of choke up. She wouldn't get hysterical, but she displayed some emotion. And when she was tickled, she would laugh. And she had this really infectious laugh and a beautiful smile. And, news is obviously very serious business. You don't want to make a joke of it. But, she made it okay to smile sometimes. And I think that the viewers need that. I think you need a little tension release when you're talking about such serious things. Sometimes a little humor is appropriate. You and I certainly have a lot of laughs on this program, Rick Walker. And that's one of the reasons that I just love working with you. And what a pleasure it is. I think we make a great team. And I wanted to take this opportunity tonight, as we did this almost 3-hour retrospective on great journalism. What a pleasure and an honor it is, and a privilege to work alongside you. And thank you for being my partner here at Maverick News.
No, thank you. No, it's the privilege is mine, and you've been able to kind of connect us with some great people as well, and you're great at networking, and you bring a high degree of professionalism here. So I appreciate all of that.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I don't know how to close this. There's only, I guess, one way to do it, right? We got to do it Huntley Brinkley style. So I'll just say good luck and good night, Rick.
Well, I'll close this way.
Are you supposed to say good night, Lori?
Well, I know good night, Lori, but I want to say, I don't know if this is news, but that too is reality.
I like that.
And these days we could use a little bit more reality. So thank you.
We try our best, don't we? And thank you everybody for watching. We appreciate you. We'll see you back here next Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for Strange Bedfellows. And good night from all of us here at Maverick News.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.